Okay, 77A, top page. Bas chol zachar psula min hakahuna. I realized I did forget to send out the chart. I'll have to send it out soon. The chart that sort of characterized which of the 4 generations of mothers that have to be investigated, or the 12 or the 16, however that's calculated.
That was very clear.
I'll try to send that a chart for that.
Well, I got it down pat, but Steve wanted a chance to show you how much he knows.
Bas chol zachar psula min hakahuna. Okay, if you have a male cholol who marries a Yisraelis, the child is posel min hakahuna. He's a chol lo'olam forever. Yisrael shenos chalolo. If you have the opposite, Yisrael that marries a female chalala, bitek shera kahuna, the child is kosher. Why is the child kosher? That's because it's yesh kiddushin ve'en avera, avlad halachach zochar. Right? This is a permitted marriage. There is kiddushin. There's no avera. There's no sin. The general principle is, in that scenario, avlad halachach zochar. The child follows the male, which is a kosher Jewish man. So the child is kosher. The opposite of chol shenas bas Yisrael, if you have a male chol, why this is repeated, we'll get to it in the Gemara. Shenas bas Yisrael that marries a Jewish girl, bita psula lekahuna, their daughter is not kosher to marry a kain. Rabbi Yehudah says bas ger zachar kibas chol zachar. The child of the daughter of a convert is like the daughter of a chol, not kosher to marry a kain. Rabbi Yaakov says, Yisrael shenosek yeros. If a male Yisrael marries a yeros, bitek shera lekahuna, the child is kosher. And similarly, the ger shenos bas Yisrael bitek shera lekahuna. If a Jew marries a woman who's a convert, or a male convert marries a Jewish girl, both of these situations bitek shera lekahuna. The children are allowed to marry a kain. But if you have a convert who marries another convert, the child is not kosher to be a kain. This is true whether it's a convert or whether it's a freed slave. They have the same status. So in other words, if 2 free slaves marry each other, the children cannot marry a kain. If there is a Jewish male or female, and right together with a slave who's of the opposite gender, then they could, then the children could marry kain. And this is true afilu ad yuderis, even for 10 generations. Let's say you have 10 generations of converts marrying converts, they still would not be allowed to marry kain. I should say imam Yisrael until the mother is Jewish. Okay. And that would be the case if the father, I presume that would be the case referring to the male, because the Mishnah previously just said the opposite, right? The Mishnah said that if a convert marries a female Jew, that would also be acceptable. Okay, Rabbi Yisrael says, Af gerushanos geras bitek shera lekahuna. Even if 2 converts get married, their children are still kosher to marry Kohanim. They themselves cannot marry, a convert cannot marry kain, but their children could, even if 2 converts married each other. Okay. Simora asks, "My lo'olam." We say that the son of a male cholol is forever a cholol. What does that mean? I would think me to have a mitzvah. Maybe just like a mitzvah and a demi, their invalid lineage only lasts 3 generations. Maybe a chol should be the same status. Kamash Malon, the Gemara is concluding here that no, their chol status lasts longer than that. Yisrael shenosa chalola, a Yisrael who married a chalola. It's interesting, by the way. I happen to know a few people that are chalolim. And I guess you have to tell their kids that they can't marry a kain. It's not terribly, unfortunately, it's not terribly uncommon. Yisrael shenotz chalola. Yisrael who marries a chalola. Minani mili. How do we know this? Okay, so if a male Yisrael marries a female chalola, the children are kosher. Amr v'yechan Mishum Shemin Nemer Kan v'leichal Zari ba'amav. Nemer lahalon leitama ba'al ba'amav. Lahalon skarv l'nekevus. Afkan skarv l'nekevus. Okay, so a woman could become a chalola. How does a woman become a chalola? By marrying a kohen when she's prohibited to marry him. We'll discuss this more at length very shortly. A kohen cannot marry a woman who's either a grusha or a zayna. A kohen gadol cannot marry a woman who's an almana. Let's say they go ahead and they do marry such a woman. What happens? The woman herself becomes a chalola. The kohen, by the way, does not. So if a kohen marries a grusha, while he's married to her, we do not allow him to serve. He can't go up to the Tiduchen, Birchas Kahana, he cannot do Birchas Kahanim, etc. Until he divorces her or commits to divorce her. How do you commit? There's a certain way to do it. Not for now. But after he divorces her, then he could go and do Birchas Kahanim. However, the woman now is a chalola. If she marries a chalol, the children will be chalolim. If she marries a Jewish male, however, then she will not produce chalolim. Why? The prohibition of the result of chalolim comes from the males, not from the females. Why? Because the word there's a prohibition for a kohen to become tamei. There's a prohibition for a kohen to make chalolim. Malahalon scharim v'nekevus, afkan scharim v'nekevus. It only refers to males and not females. So the Gemara says, "Elameata b'dish kohen gadol t'shtori." Okay, if that's the case, then the daughter of a kohen gadol, what does that mean? It means that if a kohen gadol marries an almana is a prohibited relationship, the child should be permitted. 1 second. Because effectively what we're saying is that the females are not included in the prohibition of chalolim. So why is it that the child is the girl is a chalola and she can't marry a kohen? So the Gemara says miksiv b'nai, does it say specifically sons? Zariksiv, children. Okay, therefore, what does this mean? That means that the children of a kohen become the children of a male who creates chalolim become chalolim, whether they're males or females. But you have to be a male to create chalolim. You can't be a female and create chalolim. Okay, so the Gemara says if this is the case, bas b'nai tishtari, the daughter of his son should be permitted. 1 second. Okay. Now, so in other words, because it says lo'echal zarei, that means that zarei is sort of a very collective statement. It means all his children will become chalolim. But we're saying that Zikzera Shavat said that's limited to males. So the Gemara says, 1 second, if it's limited to males, maybe it's only limited to males in the first generation. Maybe a cholol who's not really a kohen does not make his children are not chalolos. The girls that he gives birth to should be permitted to marry a kohen. And we'll say that leichal zara refers to the kohen makes everybody into chalolim. The cholol makes only his sons into chalolim, not his daughters. So the Gemara says, "Ksiv leichal zara makish zara lo mahu bita psula af b'nai bita psula." Just like the kohen's daughters are not kosher if the kohen marries a grusha, so too his son's daughters are also not kosher. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Bas pita titzer." So then, why aren't his daughters prohibited? So the Gemara says, "And kings are shafim ma'anilei." Okay, so in other words, basically, when the Torah restricts the Torah says that the ability to produce chalolim has some minor restriction, and that pertains to males and not females. So the Gemara says you take that and you understand that in the smallest context. What does that mean? A daughter of a chalol does not produce chalolim. So, for example, if a kohen marries a grusha, and he gives birth to a daughter, right? That daughter can't marry a kohen. But if she gets married to a regular Yisrael, the children could marry Kahana.
Because it goes to the father.
Because it goes to the father. Yeah. Now, what happens if the Kohen gets married to a Grusha, has a son? That son is a Chol, right? Son of Aaron who can't serve in the temple. Let's say that son has a daughter. That daughter cannot marry Kohen either. Certainly his sons are Chalalim.
But whose sons can?
But that daughter, if she marries a non-Chol, then those children could marry Kahana. Yeah. Okay. Chol shenasav as Yisrael bitay psula. If a Chol marries a regular Jewish girl, the children, his daughters, are not able to marry Kahana. Gemara says Hatana Reisha. It already says that it's the first line of the Mishnah. Bas Chol zachar psula min hakul. The daughter of a Chalol, male Chol, cannot marry Kohen forever. So Gemara says, Ayatana Reishi Yisrael shenas Chalol Tana Nami Seifa Chol shenas Avas Yisrael. Since the Mishnah specifically explicated the scenario of a female Chalol marrying a regular Yisrael, where the children could marry in, so the Mishnah also explained, specifically the details of a male Chalol marrying a kosher girl, where the halacha is the children are Chalolim. I think Gemara points out, Masisin the like Rabbi Yehudah. This mission does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Dovid. The Tanya we learned Rabbi Dovid Yehudah Aimer Kashem Shebnei Yisrael Mikveh Tahara LaChalolos Kach Bnei Yisrael Mikveh Tahara LaChalolim. Rabbi Dovid points out that just like a Jewish girl, just like a Chalola marries a Jewish man, the children are eligible to marry into Kahuna. So to the opposite is the case as well. If a Cholol marries a Jewish girl, a regular girl, then the children are eligible. The children are eligible to marry Kahana. My time in Rabbi Dovid, what's the reason? He cannot make his children into Chalolim. Okay, what does that mean? It means in one nation they make Chalolim. If a Cholol marries a Chalol, the children are Chalolim. But b'shnei amin, if the Cholol marries a Yisrael or the Chalola marries a Yisrael, in either scenario, the children are kosher. They do not make more Chalolim. Torah Rabbanon, leichal zari, only el zari, he atzma minayin. So leichal zari means we know the children become Chalolim. How do we know that she herself becomes a Cholol? In other words, let's say for example, an almono marries a kohen gadol, right? Prohibited relationship. That now she's a chalola and she can't marry a regular kohen afterwards either. Amritzu say kal v'chomer mazarei sheli over avera miskal kisha over avera enedin shemiskalalas. There's a kal v'chomer. If her children who have not sinned, right? So it's the defense of the mamzer, right? The mamzer says he never sinned; his parents sinned. So the Cholol did not sin; his mother sinned, but yet he becomes a Cholol anyway. So he shavar avera and in shemas kalalas. She that actually committed the sin, she for certain should turn into a Chalola. So Gemara says in second, you can't. That's not fair. Why? Why is that not a fair statement? Because who else sinned and doesn't become a Cholol? The husband. The kohen does not become a chol. So there's no, in other words, the fact that you actually sin doesn't prove that you become a chol. Look at the kohen. The Gemara says, "Hu atzmeichia she'avar avera ve'ein miskal." He did sin and he doesn't become a chol. Well, the Gemara says in a second, "Malahu sheken ein miskal b'kol makom." Tamer he shemiskalalos b'kol makom. 1 second. The Gemara is saying the comparison is not fair. Why is it not fair? Because we know that the woman could become problematic. What does that mean? If the woman, let's say, engages in a prohibited relationship, so the woman sleeps with her sister, her father, or her brother. Or, for example, she is with a non-Jew. In that case, she gets the status of a Zayna, and she's ineligible to marry a Kohen. Whereas if a Kohen marries a non-Jewish woman, he still stays as a Kohen. So in other words, he has a sort of protection that he never could become into a Chol. We know that her status can change to be prohibited to a Kohen, for example, through becoming a Zayna, which means engaging in a relationship which is prohibited. So therefore, he's sort of an exception to the rule. We know her status could change. Well, then why can't it change to become a chol as well? If she sins, she should become a chol, just like our kids become chalalim. Okay. The imnef shechleimer, and let's say you'll have some sort of counter argument. The Gemara doesn't. We'll talk about what exactly the counter argument is, but let's say there's a counter argument. Amakra leichal zari leichul zeh shahay kosher v'nischal. Leichal zari means so that the children don't become chalalim, and so that the person who makes the children into chalalim shouldn't become a chol either. Meaning, we see from this verse that the woman also becomes a chol. If she does engage in a prohibited relationship with a kayan, she becomes a chol as well. The Gemara says, "Mayim nefesh shechleimer." What's the secret argument that you're not telling me what it is? Okay, so this is it. Okay, in other words, you're telling me that, look, the children didn't sin yet to become chalolim, whereas she who certainly did sin, certainly she should become a chol. That's not a good argument. Why? Because the children, they were born in sin. They were conceived in sin. Maybe that's why they can become chalolim, because their conception was in sin. But maybe somebody who does sin is not the same as someone who's conceived in sin. And therefore, right, it's very anti-Catholic doctrine. Anyway,
So you penalize the offspring, but you don't penalize
the offspring was conceived in sin, and she was not. So maybe that sort of protects her from becoming a chol. So Gemara says, and that's why the verse states, that you could be kosher and become a chol if you engage in a prohibited relationship. Tanar Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Eze chalola. What is a chalola? Kol shenolda min hapsulim. Someone who is birthed by questionable lineage, invalid lineage. Okay, this statement is sort of very opaque, not exactly clear. Like if a Jew marries moms of the child as a chol,
yeah,
or a Jew marries whatever. He marries a wife he previously divorced and remarried. The child becomes a chol. No, only a kohen makes chol. Okay, well, I have to explain this. What does this mean? Anyone who's birthed by invalid parents becomes a chol. What does that mean? My psulim. Ilam psulim loi. They're not kosher for the husband. The husband engaged in a prohibited relationship. This example I just gave you. A man who marries a woman he previously was married to, divorced, then she married somebody else and got divorced from him, and then wants to go back to her first husband. It's a prohibited marriage, and yet the children are kosher. She is an abomination. You should not marry her, because she's slept with another man since she's been divorced from you. But her children are not abominations. Your children are not mamzerim. They're not presumably not chalolim either. So Rabbi Yehudah explains this is what we mean to say. What makes a girl chalola? Kol shenolda min psul kahuna. Someone who was born from a woman a kohen was not allowed to marry. So the Gemara says, one second, nolda in, loy nolda loy. Specifically, if she was born from a woman who a kohen was prohibited in. In other words, a kohen married let's say the kohen gadol marries an almana, right? And they have a child. That child is a chol because he was born, or the child is a girl. Mm-hmm. She was born from someone who was prohibited to that kohen. The Gemara says it's not quite the case, because it's not just that the child becomes a chalola, but the woman herself becomes a chalola. They weren't born from Sulam, they were born kosher. They could have married a kohen at some earlier point in their life. Then they lost that ability and they became chalolim, a chalola, by engaging in a prohibited relationship with a kohen. Rabbah says, this is what we mean to say. Ezu chalola muskeras, shaloi hayala shas hakosher klal.
Another page, Kiddushin, please.
About 8 to 10 lines in the bottom of the page.
Page,
When we talk about the well-known chalola, the chalola muskeras,
page number.
same 77a. Ezu chalola muskeras, shaloi hayala shas hakosher. That never had a moment where she was permitted. Kol shenolda mimsul kahuna. Someone who's born from a woman who is not kosher to marry a kain. My muskeras. What does it mean? The well-known chalola. In other words, you look at the Torah clearly refers to the child of the union between a kain and a woman he's prohibited with as a chalola. That's very clear in the verses. And that's what we're referring to. What's not as clear in the verses is that the woman herself also becomes a chalola. That's not specified. Okay. Now we get into very enjoyable territory.
Is there a trigger warning here?
Yes. We're getting into the sugya.
The arsenal.
No.
Launchers is poised and ready, Rabbi.
I have an iron dome, but this trigger warning is just that it's complicated and not okay. Basically, okay, sugya here is ein isur chal isur. What does that mean? Something that's let's give an easy example. Okay, you have an item. Let's say, for example, you have a piece of non-kosher meat from a cow. What is that called? It's a nevela. It's a nevela. In other words, it's not slaughtered. It was not slaughtered correctly. You bought it in Safeway. It's a nevela. Okay. Now, what happens with nevela? Now, what happens if a guy eats a nevela on Yom Kippur? He eats this meat on Yom Kippur. Does he violate the laws of Yom Kippur, or does he violate the laws of nevela, or both? Okay. For argument's sake, we'll say the classical example of Reb Shimon. This is one of the classical instances, which is why I'm giving it to you, even though it's not a preferred example. You'll see why in a moment. This is an example where Reb Shimon says you do not violate the laws of Yom Kippur. Why? Because this piece of meat was prohibited before Yom Kippur came. And now Yom Kippur comes, ein isur chal isur. A prohibited item can't have another prohibition on it. Okay, let's make an easier scenario, which is not directly spoken about. Okay, you have an animal, a nevela, wasn't slaughtered. After you shot it in the head, you discover that actually it's also a treifa. Even if it was slaughtered correctly, it would be not kosher. If somebody eats it, do they get malchus twice? Once a nevela, once a treifa? No. Ein isur chal isur. Right? The animal has a status of it. Now, we could argue it might be a little bit different because actually a treifa is born with it. Treifa is still, the animal is considered a treifa even while it's alive. In that case, it would be a treifa, not a nevela. You'd still only get malchus once. For treifa, not for nevela. Now, within ein isur chal isur, I believe there are 5 exceptions. I'll try to go through them. There might be only 4. Okay. There's an isur moisif, let's go to the easy one. It's an isur chomer, isur moisif, and isur kollel. I believe are the 4 exceptions. 3 exceptions. It might be some other ones I'm missing. Okay. Anyway, those I have offhand, and those are relevant to the next Gemara. Isur chomer is very easy. Okay, nevela on Yom Kippur is a perfect example of an isur chomer. It also happens to be an isur kollel as well. We'll explain in a moment. Isur chomer is that the second prohibition is much more severe. That would be an example of an isur chomer. Another possibility is isur moisif. Okay, and isur kollel. Isur kollel is something like Yom Kippur, as an example of an isur kollel. Yom Kippur doesn't just prohibit the meat in Safeway; it prohibits all the food in the world. So it has something to do. In that case, some opinions say we could say in isur kollel isur, because this isur has nothing to do with the fact that this was already prohibited. This isur included hundreds of things, right?
Yeah.
And among them is the meat in Safeway, the non-kosher meat, the nevela. That's an example of an isur kollel. There's another exception called an isur moisif. An isur moisif is a little bit of a variation of that. So an isur kollel includes tons of different items, and it also includes some things that are prohibited. An isur moisif says this item that was previously prohibited becomes prohibited now to more people. So this obviously is only relevant in things that are prohibited to a limited amount of people. So, for example, you have a woman who's a widow, right? She's prohibited to a kohen gadol. Then she marries. Let's just see the Gemara. What I'm thinking is almana. A guy has a relationship with a widow 3 times. Well, what does a widow 3 times mean? You'll have to figure that out. We'll get to it in a moment. What exactly widow 3 times means? Does it mean he had 3 relationships with a widow? Does it mean he had relationships with 3 different widows, or does it mean that she was thrice widowed? Okay, we'll get to it. He's only liable once. Grusha 3 times. We'll explain that also. He's only chayav 1 time. Let's say a woman is an almana, grusha, v'chalola, zaina. So she was widowed, divorced, turned into a chalola, and then into a zaina. When it happened in that order, he's liable for each one. We'll explain this as well. What happens if you have a different scenario? Zinsa, she engaged in an act which turns her into a zaina. That would be a prohibited relationship, not necessarily with a kohen. V'nis chalala, then she married a kohen and she became a chalala. V'nis garsha, v'nis armala, then she became a grusha and an almana, and then she has a relationship with the kohen gadol. And a chayav alachas, she's only chayav once. Amar almana, 3 times almana. What? Ein chayav alachas, she's only chayav once. Hay almana hekidam. What does that mean? The kohen married the widows of 3 different men, 3 different women, effectively. How are you from Mechlakin? How are Shemus Mechlakin? They're different people. They're different acts. Why is he only chayav once? He marries one widow 3 times. He has 3 relationships with one widow. If they didn't warn him in between, then obviously he's only chayav once. They warned him each act of intercourse. So Gemara says, if that's the case, so why is he only chayav once? But tonight we learned a nazir prohibited to drink wine, and anyway he drank it anyway. He was drinking wine a whole day. He's only chayav once. The witnesses hung around him a whole day, and they kept telling him, "Al tishta, don't drink." He's chayav for each warning he disregarded. Malchus, separate lashes for each warning. So the Gemara says, this woman was married 3 times. She was widowed 3 times, and he married this woman. I would think she's an almana from 3 different men. You need to have different women. The fact that they were all, the fact that it's one woman in one action doesn't make you liable twice, even if she was thrice widowed. We're together? No.
Yeah, well, of course we are, Rabbi.
So, in other words, if she was widowed 3 times, she's still the same woman. It's still only one act of intercourse, and therefore he's only chayav once. Even though the title of widow is applied to her 3 times by 3 different people, it doesn't make a difference.
If he did this with 3 different,
then he would be liable. Or if he did 3 actions with the same person. 3 acts of intercourse with the same person with a warning in between, that would also be the same. It's where over here the argument is, look, she has the title widow for 3 different men. So in the single act of intercourse, he violates 3 titles of widow. Right? She's the widow of Reuben, the widow of Shimon, the widow of Levi. Right?
okay.
So therefore, maybe you'd think that he would be liable 3 times. No, he's only liable once for 1 act. Okay. Okay. Almana, grusha, v'chalola, zaina. He marries a woman that's an almana, a grusha, a chalola, and a zaina. So Gemara says, "Hi Tana, Micah suffer." What does our Tana hold? Okay, so what did he do? He married a woman. There was a woman that was an almana, right? She was a widow. Then she got married to somebody else and got divorced. So now she's an almana and a grusha. Then what happened was she married a kohen. That's a big no-no. What did she become now? A chalola. And then she goes ahead and sleeps with a non-Jew. Now she's a zaina. right? Or any of the 16 erevos. So she's gotten 4 titles now, one after another. The Mishnah says you get if a Kohen Gadol sleeps with her now, 4 prohibitions, right? 1 for an almana, 1 for grusha, 1 for halala, 1 for zayna. You got it?
Yeah.
Hi Tana Ika Savar. 1 second, but we have a problem here. Ika Savar Isser Halal Isser. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's just go back for a second. Hold on a second before we continue. Okay, in that case, you get Malchus for all 4 of them. Let's say, however, on the other hand, the opposite story happens. So the first thing she does is sleep with a non-Jew. Number 2 is she goes and marries a Kohen. Now she's, what is she? She's a Zayna, and now she married a Kohen, she's a Halala. Then she gets divorced from the Kohen. So now she's a Grusha. Then she marries some random Jew, and the guy dies. Now she's an Almana. And now she marries a Kohen. How many prohibitions is there? Only 1. What's the difference? That's the Gemara's question. Micah Savar, what's going on here? Ika Savar Isser Chal Isser. Do we hold that one Isser could something that's prohibited could become prohibited again? If that's the case, then Ibchanami. Why does it make a difference what order happened? Why does it make a difference if the Zayna event happened last or first? Who cares? The Ika Savar, but if he holds Ein Isser Chal Isser, that one prohibition something that's prohibited cannot become prohibited again. So then, even in this order, meaning widow, divorced, halala, zayna, it should also be a single violation, not 4 violations. So Rava says, okay, so here is Isser Moisef. Haitana Isser Chal Isser Leslie, Isser Moisef Isli. Okay. This is a unique category. Generally speaking, we say Ein Isser Chal Isser, but this is an exception. How is this an exception? It's an exception called Isser Moisef. So let's start with the first scenario. This woman, we'll go with both scenarios. We'll call it, right, the scenario A and scenario B. Scenario A, what does she do? She marries an almana. Who's she prohibit? She becomes an almana. She becomes an almana, right? She becomes an almana. Who is she prohibited to now? Just the Kohen Gadol. Okay. Then she marries another guy and she gets divorced. Now who's she prohibited to? All Kohanim. So now we have an Isser Moisef. We've taken this woman and we've saying, hold on, the population of people that are prohibited to her are now wider. Mm-hmm. It started off as Kohen Gadol very narrow, and now all of a sudden it grew to all Kohanim. Okay, now she sleeps with a Kohen, right? What happens? She becomes a Chalala. Okay, what's the difference of whether she's Chalala or not? The title of Chalala can apply to a woman and to restrict her from eating truma. For example, if let's say she was a Kohenet, right? And she became a Grusha, she got divorced. She does not have children, she's still allowed to eat truma. However, as soon as she has a relationship with a Kohen, then she becomes a Chalala, and she's disqualified from eating truma. So the law of Chalala is more expansive than the law of Grusha, because it's not just a prohibition to marry a Kohen, but it's also a prohibition for a Kohenet to eat truma. Okay, the last one, Zayna, we'll get to in a moment. Okay, now let's go scenario B, the opposite happened. She starts off as a Zayna, okay? Well, Zayna, okay. Then she becomes a Chalala. What does Chalala mean? She's prohibited to all Kohanim, and she's prohibited to eat truma if she was Kohenet. Now she becomes a Grusha. Did anything change? Any more population expands this or no? No, she's already prohibited to a Kohen. So therefore we say Ein Isser Chal Isser. Okay, so let's go through this. Okay. Almana asur l'kohen gadol. A widow is prohibited to a kohen gadol. B'shar l'kohen hedit. She's permitted to a kohen hedit. Havi l'grusha. Now she becomes divorced. Migudi itaisef le'isur l'gabi kohen hedit. Itaisef le'isur l'gabi kohen gadol. Since she becomes prohibited to all kohanim, so we say that she becomes prohibited again to a kohen gadol. So there's 2 prohibitions now. She's prohibited to a kohen because she's an almana, and now again because she's a grusha. But if she was a kohenet, she could still eat truma. But once she has a relationship with a Kohen, Havila Chalala, she's disqualified from Truma. Since now there's additional prohibition, she can't eat Truma. So now Kohen Gadol is prohibited to her for a 3rd time. Almana, Grusha, Chalala. Okay, Elazayna Mayas or Isbay. The title of Zayna, which population does she become prohibited? Yisrael is allowed to marry a Zayna. Let's be very clear here. There's two definitions to a Zayna. A Zayna, in the context of a Kayan, a Zayna means a woman who has had a prohibited relationship. In the context of a Jew, a Zona is a prostitute. And a man is allowed to marry a Zona if they're actually getting married and she's abandoning her previous ways. He is not allowed to have a fling, obviously, with a prostitute. That would obviously be prohibited. That's the Isra of Kiddushin. Okay, so my Isra Ma'isa Vispa. So now, if we're talking about, she has a status of a Zayna. Okay, fine. Yisrael is allowed to marry a Zayna if he's not engaging in an act of znus, i.e., he's not in a brothel. She was a Zayna in the past. Yisrael is allowed to choose to marry her. I'm not saying it's recommended, but he is permitted. It's permitted. And even a woman who's a clear Zayna, she was an adulterer. He's another man who's neither the adulterer nor the husband is allowed to marry her. So what's the additional prohibitions? The Gemara says, Amar Rav Chanan bar Rav Katina hoyel v'shem znus paisel v'Yisrael. Because the concept of Zayna exists by a Jew, that means that if a woman is an adulterer, she is prohibited to both the adulterer and her husband whom she violated. So therefore, we consider this as sort of a more expansive category, even though actually nobody is included. There's no additional person that became prohibited. But because she entered into a category that does have other types of prohibitions, we consider this to be an Isser Ma'isa. We consider it to be an additional prohibition, and therefore you violate 4 prohibitions. Okay. Stop here.
Is there like a simple rule if it becomes more expansive?
So again, there are some opinions that go with this rule. This is not universal. So there's 3, like I said, there's 3 exceptions to Issachar. So I think there's 3. Might be missing one. Isser Ma'isif, Isser Kollel, Isser Chomer. Isser Ma'isif is where more people are relevant to the same prohibition. Isser Kollel is where the prohibition affects more items. And Isser Kollel is typically a time-bound Isser. For example, like if you had something that was like a Nevel on Yom Kippur, be a very good example of an Isser Kollel. Isser Ma'isif typically refers to, typically is around people, different types of prohibitions amongst different types of groups. And then Isser Chomer is where the prohibition is much more severe. Like in Kippur, for example, on Nevel. Nevel is only a lav, in Kippur is the Chayve Krisis. Much more severe penalties. That would also be a potential. Now, not everybody holds of every exception.
Okay.
There are some that hold just of Isser Kollel. There are some that hold just of Isser Chomer, etc.